Good afternoon and welcome to this e-session on Experts Overview on COVID-19, Prevention, Treatment and Post-COVID Effects. On behalf of Merchants Chamber of Commerce and Industry, it is my pleasure to host this webinar, which we hope will prove to be beneficial to all of us. Friends, we are presently witnessing a virulent second wave of COVID in our country. The entire healthcare ecosystem has been challenged to its limit with this onslaught. The pandemic is also taking a heavy toll on our economy as well. During the first quarter of this year, we were most optimistic with infection rates decreasing and vaccination process that was started for specific age groups. However, the optimism was short-lived and we all were caught unaware by the intensity of the second wave. The entire country witnessed shortage and challenges in supplies of oxygen and other medical supplies. With the pandemic now affecting a wider demographic diaspora, the vaccination process too has been challenged. To add to these concerns, we now have a new challenge for post-COVID recovery in the form of fungal infections in COVID patients, black fungus or mucormycosis, white fungus or Aspergillus flavus, and yellow fungus are some of the common terms we are coming across in the media reports today.
Sorry, Dr. Saab, I think there is some problem with Akash's connection.
Of All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, to counsel us in these matters. Dr. Randeep Guleria is a renowned pulmonologist and the incumbent director of AIIMS, Delhi. Dr. Guleria did his undergraduate degree in medicine from Indira Gandhi Medical College. He did his post-graduation in general medicine and pulmonary medicine from Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research, Chandigarh. In 1992, he joined AIIMS as an assistant professor, and in 2011, Dr. Guleria established India's first center for respiratory diseases and sleep medicine at AIIMS, New Delhi. Dr. Guleria has been in the forefront of our battle against COVID pandemic, and the nation owes him a debt and his team for their efforts over the last couple of years. On behalf of MCCI, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Guleria for his exemplary service to the nation. And with this, I would request, sir, for your advice to the audience.
Thank you very much for your kind words, and I'd like to thank the Merchant Chambers of Commerce and Industry for inviting me over. I shall be talking on a wide range of topics, and therefore I'll just give an overview and then we could have questions if time permits. But are my slides visible?
Yes, they are very clear.
Okay, so I'll just give an overview of preventive treatment and post-COVID effects, because I think that is something that everyone is interested in. And then we can have some questions at the end. I'll just take around 25 minutes or so. So what I'm going to cover is what exactly is COVID-19, how can we prevent it, what are the broad strategies of treatment, not indoor treatment, I won't cover that, but in general as far as home treatment is concerned, and of course, the post-COVID or the long COVID or the COVID long haulers as we know them, what about them? So what is COVID? We know that this is a coronavirus. Now, coronavirus are a large family of viruses that cause illnesses ranging from common cold to severe diseases. As a matter of fact, there are 4 coronaviruses, which usually called mild illness, like a flu-like illness, and we really get these infection and become all right. However, there are 3 of them which cause very severe problem. One of them, of course, is the SARS-CoV, which was reported in 2002 and caused a huge outbreak in Canada and in Southeast Asia, especially in Hong Kong. But luckily, it did not really become a pandemic. We have another outbreak of MERS coronavirus, which is happening in the Middle East, and this is known as MERS-CoV, and this is causing again infection in pockets, but basically emanating from the Middle East. And there are people who have come there and got the infection and gone back, especially when they come for a religious purpose like Hajj and other things. But the cause of concern, of course, is SARS-CoV-2, which is a new strain which was discovered in Wuhan. China in 2019 and was not previously identified in humans. Now, why is it important as compared to others? Whenever we talk of a pandemic, we are looking at two things for any virus. One is it has to be a novel virus so that there is no immunity that exists in mankind as far as that virus is concerned. And secondly, the virus has to have the ability to have good human to human spread. We have another other viral infections is like avian flu, bird flu, which doesn't have the ability for good human to human spread and has not become a pandemic. So for a pandemic virus, it has to be novel and has to have the ability for good human to human spread. Now, over a period of time, we have seen that many viruses have jumped species and have now started affecting humans. Luckily, like I said, many of them have not really had that ability to have sustained human to human spread and have not become a pandemic. But there has been concern of a pandemic way back from 1998 when there was an outbreak of what we call N1 bird flu. And after that, over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen a lot of outbreaks which have been warning signs that a big pandemic is due. We had SARS in 2003, MERS, like I said, in 2012. We've had Ebola, we've had the Zika infection in between, and we've had the H1N1, the swine flu pandemic also. And all of these have actually originated from species and jumped species to affect human. And therefore, deforestation, wet markets, and other things that have also contributed to all of this. Almost in 2018, I had written an editorial where we had actually said that after about 100 years after the Spanish flu pandemic, we were still vulnerable and we need to be ready for any pandemic which may come out because of the fact that we still were seeing these sort of red flags in the last few years. So what is COVID-19? It is basically a viral respiratory illness caused by severe SARS-CoV-2. And the important thing to remember is that although we started off by thinking that this is just a viral pneumonia, we now understand that this virus has a very wide presentation. And not only does it affect the lungs, it affects the blood vessels, what we call endothelitis, leading to clotting. And at times it can lead to a huge inflammatory response in the body known as a cytokine storm, where there is a dysregulation of the body's own immune system. So it can be a mild illness, you can be asymptomatic, and it can be a severe life-threatening illness, which can really lead to a loss of life. The number of cases has been huge, as you can see by this data the John Hopkins University, and we've had a large number of deaths, and India has contributed significantly as being the number 2 in terms of number of cases. So at 27.5 million cases, India has the second largest documented COVID-19 cases in the world. We are not that high if you look at number of cases per million population. So this also reflects the large population that our country has, but we still have a huge number of cases as far as COVID-19 is concerned. We have gone through the deadly second wave, as was mentioned. We've had this first wave, and then we had this huge second wave, and we are now luckily seeing the downward trend. But there were a lot of signals which suggested that we would see this, and this actually reflects what happened as far as 1918 was concerned. This is the 1918 Spanish flu waves, and you can see that the first wave was not that big. The second wave actually was huge and caused a large amount of deaths, and then it came down and led to another third wave subsequently, which was not that bad as compared to the second wave. So it is basically something that we need to learn from history. And it's important to remember that the reason for why we had the second wave even more than 100 years ago was that people felt that the influenza pandemic is over once the first wave came down. And for that, during that time, there was lack of appropriate behavior. People started mixing, there were partying to celebrate the pandemic being over. And this led to the huge surge in the virus, which led to this huge surge in cases. And if you look at the data from the Indian registry, which is also there, that was a time when India was under British rule, there was a huge mortality that happened in large part of our country, especially central and the eastern part of India. So I think there are lessons from history also. As far as COVID-19 transmission is concerned, we know that it is basically a droplet infection. It can also be aerosol, that is, the virus can stay in the air for quite some time and can travel more than 2 meters. But by and large, it's a droplet infection, and it can also be settled on surfaces and cause infection through that. But the more recent data suggest that possibly droplet infection on surfaces may not be that important a cause as the airborne infection in the form of droplets and aerosol. And that's what we need to keep in mind. And that's why masking everyone is very, very important. So what are the likely causes of this massive second wave, which has taken a lot of lives and caused a lot of suffering? So one is relaxation of COVID precautions during that time because of a feeling that things were all over and vaccine was being rolled out. There was opening of schools, theater, gyms, and there were large public gatherings which allowed the virus to spread rapidly. There was laxity among public because they felt that the pandemic had ended, and there was large indoor gathering without masks. And I think also this was further driven by the arrival of various mutants which were more infectious and were able to spread the virus more quickly. And that is why the second wave was so sharp in terms of its rate of ascent and the number of cases. We all know the common symptoms, so I'm not going to go into the detail, but cough, fever, chills, muscle pain, shortness of breath, and then a sore throat, and then a loss of the sense of taste or smell are common symptoms. And if anyone has these symptoms, it's very important that they do get themselves tested for COVID-19 infection. If you look at the symptoms, almost 88% of people have fever, and therefore fever has become one of the most important features to keep in mind. But do remember that almost 10% may not have fever. And then you have mainly respiratory symptoms in the form of cough, breathlessness, sore throat, running nose. And this is followed by fatigue, myalgias, and 3% or 4% in one series had diarrhea. Our observation is that in the second wave, possibly diarrhea was more common than this, and this could also be one of the atypical presentation as far as COVID-19 is concerned. If you look at the mortality, and this is across what we've seen even in the second wave, although we've argued that it causes more infection in the young, the mortality continues to be higher in the older age group. And as you see, if you're more than 60 years and above, there's a huge jump in the mortality from it being, if you were less than 50, it's less than 1%. And then if you're more than 60, it becomes 3.6% and going up to 15% if you're 80 and above. And that is why the vaccine has focused on trying to vaccinate the high risk group, that is those who are in the older age group. And of course, if there are comorbidities like hypertension, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, chronic lung diseases, or chronic heart disease, then you are more prone, and that becomes an added factor along with age if that is present. Prevention. I think the most important preventive aspect is COVID appropriate behavior, which is basically wearing your mask, maintaining physical distance, and regular hand washing. Vaccination is also another very important preventive measure because it breaks the chain of transmission and causes less severe disease, and therefore there is a need to upgrade vaccination as quickly as possible and to maintain the pace so that a larger number of people can get vaccinated. Also, there is a utility that if you have hotspots or areas where your infection rate is very high, a lockdown or a containment area in that locality will help in a large way to really cut down the transmission and prevent the infection from spreading to other areas. And this has been shown to be very useful also in the second wave. Now, what are the lessons that we learned from the flu pandemic in 1918? What it really showed was that tighter restrictions actually led to lower deaths and greater economic recovery, because then the cases came down quickly and you were able to really get the economy back. And this is what was seen in many cities in the US, that those areas where you had strict policies, like in Seattle or Portland, you had the mortality was much less, and your increase in manufacturing employment also went up quickly, as compared to those areas where you are more lenient in terms of your restrictions. And therefore, I think it's important to really learn from all of this and see why it's important to have restrictions when you have a high number of positivity in a certain area. Coming to vaccines, what about vaccines? Now, vaccines have been touted as the most effective public health measures to end the pandemic. They are very useful since the discovery of the smallpox vaccine by Edward Jenner. Vaccines have really changed how things are, the preventive aspects, and many infections have been eliminated from the planet because of mass vaccination program, whether it be smallpox or polio. And the last 6 months, we have seen a large number of vaccines getting emergency use authorization, and more than 1 billion people worldwide have been vaccinated. Now, the important thing to remember is that this is the first time that so many vaccines had been developed for one infection. As a matter of fact, if you do a literature search, you'll find that currently more than 250 vaccines are under trial for just COVID-19. And that shows the interest there is in vaccine as far as current research is concerned. And I personally feel that this year is going to be the year of vaccinology, where we'll see a lot of development as far as vaccine research is concerned. And this has led us to feel that with vaccination, we will be able to see the end of this pandemic. But what do vaccines do? Vaccines actually induce an immune response among us against the virus whenever we are exposed to the disease. And there are multiple ways that vaccine can help us. One is that it can prevent infection, that we don't get COVID at all. This is seen by some vaccines, but it is not 100%. More often, vaccines actually help in preventing disease. And that means that you may have the infection, but you will not become ill. You will not require hospital admissions. You will not require intensive care treatment, and this thereby they will lead to decrease in death. Also, vaccines, by decreasing the viral load and decreasing the duration of infection, can also prevent transmission. So we are looking at vaccines basically to decrease illness and to some extent prevent infection. We have a large number of vaccines in India, and this is again something which is very, very heartening, because India was the manufacturing hub, but there was very little R&D being done in India, and most of the vaccines that India was making 60% of the global vaccine, but it was mainly manufacturing rather than research in it. But now we have a large number of Indian companies which are working aggressively to make vaccines. We already have Covishield, Covaxin, Zycovd has finished its phase 3 trial by Zydus Cadila, and all these are different platforms. Zycovd is a DNA vaccine. Covaxin is an inactivated viral vector vaccine, and inactivated virus vaccine, and Covishield is a viral vector vaccine. Then we have Sputnik, which is also being marketed by Dr. Reddy's laboratory. And then we have Serum Institute of India, Biologicals, Genova, and Bharat Biotech looking at other different types of vaccines. So I think this is an exciting time, and I hope that this will lead to a lot of research and development in the future for vaccines as far as our country is concerned. The Indian vaccine response has been graded, but has gradually picked up, and I think we have reached a target where we have actually vaccinated a large number of people, and almost 12% of our population has received at least one dose, and 3% has been fully vaccinated. Now, although this looks small in terms of percentage, but if you look at the absolute number, over 16 crore Indians have received at least one dose. This has actually gone up to now close to 20 crores. And this means that we have actually vaccinated people who equivalent to the population of many countries in Europe. And therefore, the vaccination program is moving on, but obviously because of the size of our population, we need to do more. But developing a vaccine is only half the work done. Delivering it equitably is more important. And I think this is very important to understand, that unless we are able to vaccinate everyone, we will not be able to get rid of the pandemic or be able to prevent the emergence of variants. Because the variants come out from areas where the virus is rapidly replicating or where there is ongoing infection. So if you vaccinate one part of the world, but in the other part, the virus continues to multiply, it will develop new variants which may affect the vaccine which has been given to the other part of the world. And that is why global vaccination has to be considered. Now, manufacturing billions of doses has been manufactured, but if you look at the data, more than 50% of the vaccines actually are being procured or have been ordered by the developed world, maybe just about 5 or 6 countries. And that is something that we need to keep in mind. And this is clearly shown that if you were to vaccination was distributed only to the high income countries, you would avert only 33% of deaths. But if you were able to vaccinate everyone, depending on the population, you would be able to avert 61% of deaths. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. Coming to the new strains, we have various strains which have been caused the variants of concern. The variant of B117, which was discovered in UK in Kent. Now, what is its clinical implication? Definitely, it increases transmissibility. There is some data that increases mortality. It can lead to higher deaths. But currently, there is not much data which suggests that it affects the vaccine efficacy. The South African strain, the B1351, there is some concern because of the mutant E484 that this may decrease the efficacy of vaccines to some extent, and this is something that is being looked at. The strain from Brazil, the B1, again, there is it is more transmissible, and there is some concern that it may impact immunity. The strain from India, the B1617, which has the two mutations which make it more infectious, definitely is causing increased transmissibility. There may be a moderate reduction as far as the efficacy of the vaccine is concerned. So if you look at the UK variant, B117, what the data suggests is, by and large, most vaccines are effective against this variant, and they have comparable neutralizing activity, and the efficacy of the vaccine does not really come down significantly. If you look at the South African variant, here there is some data which suggests that the virus vaccine efficacy may be less. To some extent, there's one paper which is published from South Africa, which suggests that the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Covishield, may have significant decrease in its efficacy. But it's a small study. Current data suggests that these vaccines may have a decrease in their efficacy, but they may still be effective against the infection, and therefore the vaccines still have a role even if you have these variants in circulating in a particular region. As far as B1617 is concerned, there is again some data which suggests that this may have some resistance to the mRNA vaccine, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. However, data does suggest that this may still be able to be effective, and the vaccine may still work against these variants. But we are collecting and getting more and more data, because one has to really look at how the variants affect the vaccine if we have to look at vaccination in the near future. If you look at data from India, which has looked at all these variants, including the Indian variant, the double mutant, as far as Covaxin is concerned, the data from the National Institute of Virology suggests that this is effective in neutralizing the double mutant also, and also that it is effective against the strain found in UK, Brazil, and South Africa. Now, we may have to sort of tweak the vaccines as new variants develop, and this is something that is already being looked at by researchers across the world, and this is not something that is new, because this is something that we've been doing for influenza. Every year we have a new influenza virus vaccine, because the vaccine, the virus undergoes what we call an antigenic drift, and that leads us to develop a new sort of vaccine. And that is, it's possible that we may have to do this for COVID-19 also, that if we develop a variant which develops significant immune escape mechanism, we may have to look at changing the vaccine to some extent, or tweaking it so that it covers for the variant as we go along. Briefly coming to treatment, I won't spend much time on this. We basically divide it in our country as mild, moderate, and severe disease, based on basic parameters which look at your saturation and respiratory rate. And if your saturation is good, you don't have any shortness of breath, it is basically mild disease. If your saturation is between 90 to 93, it's a moderate disease. And if it is less than 90 and your respiratory rate is high, it becomes a severe disease. It's important to remember that mild disease occurs in majority of people, around 80%, and they can be treated at home. Around 15% have moderate disease and need hospital admission, and 5% have severe disease requiring ICU admission, and the overall mortality varies from 1 to 2%. So mild disease, upper respiratory tract symptoms, no shortness of breath, good saturation, home isolation and care can be done. But for home isolation, you must have certain prerequisites. You must have mild disease, or you should be asymptomatic. You must have a facility or at home, the setup that you can self-isolate yourself at home. If your immunity is low, for example, you're HIV positive, transplant recipients, or cancer patient on chemotherapy, then you should not be in home isolation. It's better that you're under observation. For elderly patients or those with comorbidities, it has to be evaluated. But if your comorbidities are under good control and you're otherwise fit, under close supervision, you could still be in for home isolation. You should have a caregiver. There should be communication with the hospital or the healthcare provider, and you must be closely monitored by the district surveillance officer. I won't go into the details, but the treatment strategy is physical distancing, regular wearing masks, hand washing, monitoring yourself regularly. There is a chart which is available on the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare website, which area you're supposed to fill up every day, and basic symptomatic treatment for fever, cough, and cold, and multivitamins can be taken. And you must stay in contact with the healthcare provider, and there has to be one healthcare provider who is able to look after you and provide you with all your needs in terms of meals and other things. And masking is very important for both the healthcare provider and the person who is COVID positive. Coming to COVID-19 and CT scanning, it's not required in all patients, and therefore it has to be done at the discretion of the doctor. And in mild patients, there is really no need for CT scan. There is also some data which suggests that going to a CT scan area with a lot of positive patients, a lot of patients being out there, can be a super spreading event. There is also data that repeated CT scans may have insignificant radiation exposure, increasing the risk of future malignancies. So for CT scans are usually not really required. Coming finally to the post-COVID effects, which is another important issue. Now, this is something that is being recognized almost now for 8-9 months. And this paper published almost 8-9 months ago in 143 Italian patients who were hospitalized for COVID-19 found that 83% continue to have at least one symptoms even 60 days after discharge. And another paper from Switzerland, which looked at around 669 patients, again found that almost 32% continue to have at least one symptom, even almost 6 weeks after they were discharged. And therefore, what it really suggests is that a large number of people continue to have what we call post-COVID or ongoing COVID symptoms, even after 4 weeks. And if it is from 4 to 12 weeks, it's an ongoing COVID symptom. If it's more than 12 weeks, it becomes a post-COVID symptom or long COVID. So this is the data which looks at the common symptoms that you get after recovering from COVID. And the most common that you see are fatigue, dyspnea, joint pains, and chest pain. Many patients continue to complain of palpitations. Some have persisting dry cough, which lasts for weeks, and they need symptomatic treatment. So it's important to keep this in mind that some people, even after recovering, have these symptoms. And if you look at the range, then you can see that fatigue, dyspnea is breathlessness, chest comfort, cough, and loss of smell can occur anywhere between 15 to 87% in various series, and this can last from almost 1 to 3 months. Even psychological symptoms like post-traumatic stress, impaired memory, poor concentration, anxiety, and depression can last for weeks to months. And this has also been reported almost around 1/4 of patients who have recovered from COVID. Therefore, COVID-19 may impair quality of life for weeks to months, and this is something that we need to keep in mind. How do we treat them? Importantly, it's symptomatic treatment. As far as fatigue and breathlessness is concerned, one really asks them to follow the 3 Ps, that is planning. Plan to do important tasks when you expect to have the most energy, that is in the morning. So do it slowly, don't overexert yourselves. We've seen patients who really come out and become negative and started going to gym and suddenly collapsed out there. So plan, pace yourself depending on how much activity you can do, and take breaks, and prioritize what you need to do immediately and what can wait, and do it at your own pace. Don't really think that you've recovered immediately and start going back to complete work. Adequate sleep is very important. Maintain a good sleep hygiene, that is going to bed and getting up at the same time, avoiding caffeine and alcohol. And then physiotherapy and rehabilitation is also something which is very, very important in terms of being able to do regular exercises, improving your heart health through exercise, dietary changes. And if you are a smoker, then it's high time that you quit smoking, because it will also affect your lungs. There can be psychological effects, like I said, anxiety, depression, poor concentration. And for this, you need to do meditation, yoga, but sometimes some people have required medication as far as this is concerned. And for features like persisting cough, chest pain, body aches, symptomatic treatment is also given. So to conclude, I would just like to, I've just given you a broad overview rather than going into any area in great detail, because there's a lot to cover in 20, 25 minutes. But what I'd like to conclude is that COVID-19 is a viral respiratory illness of varying severity. It is more than just causing respiratory effects. Causes systemic effects, and we know that it can cause both increased chance of clotting, and that is why in moderate to severe disease we give drugs which are blood thinners. It can also cause cytokine storm, and that is why steroids and at times other drugs are given because of the hyperinflammatory response that this virus can cause. It spreads via the respiratory route, and that's basically droplet and airborne through aerosol, and that is why two or three things are very important. One is regular masking. The other is, if you have an indoor environment where there is a chance of a lot of people coming in, it's very important to have good cross ventilation. So keep your windows open. If there is an AC, then it should have fresh air coming in, and try and have good cross ventilation, because that will help in decreasing or not allowing the virus to stay in the air for a long period of time, and it will go out. Social distancing and masking are the best way to prevent the spread, and I think this is something that we will have to follow for many months as we go ahead. Vaccine are the key to control the pandemic worldwide. It has to be equitable. We have to work on a strategy that we have more and more vaccines available for our country, and we can vaccinate as many people as possible in the earliest time. Patients with mild illness can be treated at home. I've shown the protocols that need to be adopted. And in patients with mild illness, actually, it's basically symptomatic treatment that is required. Most patients become all right on their own with just symptomatic treatment. They don't need high-end drugs like remdesivir or steroids, because they may cause more harm than benefit. And just symptomatic treatment and observation at home is required. It's only that we need to pick up those 15% who may go into moderate or severe illness and be able to admit them early rather than late, and they should not be staying at home if the saturation is falling. And like I've said, there is data now which suggests a significant number of patients have post-COVID symptoms which can last for 3 months or even more than 3 months, and many of them will recover. But some patients have extensive irreversible damage, which could be in the lung in the form of fibrosis in the lung. It could be in the heart and leading to cardiac involvement and weakened cardiac muscles, leading to breathlessness and chest pain. It can be a stroke, which can lead to weakness of some part of the body. And therefore, many of these individuals will require long-term rehabilitative care. But most people who have post-COVID sequelae tend to recover by the third month, but they do need care. And that's why as our cases have come down now, we will have to focus on post-COVID treatment in terms of providing them treatment with post-COVID clinics. Thank you very much. I could have I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. I think this has been an extremely engaging presentation. I thought there are so many takeaways, and it would be great if we could get a copy of this presentation, because it would act as a great resource for not only the people attending this webinar, but to the entire membership base of our chamber. So, with that, I would request you to take a few questions, because I've been getting a lot of WhatsApp messages. So I would request Shri Santosh Saraf, who is our past president, to ask you the first question. Mr. Saraf, please go ahead, unmute yourself and ask the first question.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Dr. Saab. You have narrated very nicely, and we have come to know what is the COVID and what precaution we should take. Thank you very much. But still, publicly, people are fearing is very much. How to remove this fearing? That is the main thing.
So I get your question. The issue is that there is a lot of panic and fear as far as COVID is concerned. And I think a lot of it, as we've said, in not only dealing with the pandemic, but dealing with also the infodemic. There is a lot of information on social media, on WhatsApp, which creates a panic, and one feels that there would be, if you have COVID or if you take the vaccine, your immunity will come down, you will get COVID infection, or if you have COVID, your heart will become weak, or you will have clotting happening. So I think it's important that we as the group work, and this is healthcare professionals and others, to really address the panic and other issues that people have, and try and sort of counter the infodemic that is going along. But what has happened is, and one of the causes of a lot of side effects of medication is basically the panic reaction, which has led to over medication and side effects of medication, with high dose steroids being used, people's sugars going up to 400, 500, which we are seeing. And like I said, mild COVID, actually, even if you look at treatment all over the world, it is basically symptomatic. In the UK, US, they will just give you paracetamol and supportive treatment, and they will not even give you anything else. So it's important for us to understand that people with mild disease need more reassurance than anything else, and we need to work on that. Because of the panic reaction and getting too many blood tests done, they sometimes start over sort of interpreting and land up with panic and more problems.
Great.
Thank you, Doctor.
Now, can I request Mr. MC Shah, another past president of our chamber, to ask his query? So you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Now you can hear me? Yeah. So I must compliment you, sir, for taking care of all the patients and putting your life to risk. The entire medical fraternity deserves compliments. Sir, I've got 2-3 questions. One is that the gap between the 2 doses has been increased from 6 to 8 weeks to 12 to 16 weeks. Is it because of the shortage of vaccines or efficacy? This is my first question. My second question is about the effect, after effect or side effect of the vaccine. You know, sir, most of the seniors, they do not have any side effect, whereas the younger crowd, they had the side effect. So what is the reason? Or, you know, there are, you know, myths that maybe some people have not received the vaccine, they have simply given the water or something like that. And third question is, sir, that the New York Times, you know, talking about the death and other things, cases, almost like 15 times what India has been talking about. Every day, you know, these news are there. I don't know why these are being spread and why there is no action taken against these people. So these are my 2-3 questions. And another is, there will be 5-6 type of different vaccines. Can any 2 vaccines can be taken in 2 different doses, or we have to go and wait for the same vaccine for the second dose? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll answer all your questions one by one. One is regarding the gap in Covishield. So if you look at the data, the current recommendation is that there is no gap as far as Covaxin is concerned. Covaxin has to be taken at 4 to 6 weeks. But the scientific data was there for Covishield, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine. And this happened because in December, when there was a huge surge in cases in UK, and they were having their wave, which was causing a huge mortality and hospital admissions, they changed their policy and started giving the vaccine after 12 weeks. They did it both for Pfizer and for the AstraZeneca vaccine. They also collected data for that. And what they found was that with the AstraZeneca vaccine, if you were to give it early, that is between the first 4 to 5 weeks, the immunity that you were getting was only around 55 to 60%. But if you gave it after 12 weeks, which they did, this immunity went up to almost 80%. So they therefore felt that their decision was, although they took a chance at that point in time, because they wanted to vaccinate everyone with 1 dose, whether it was Pfizer or AstraZeneca, but they then were able to show that this was also proven by scientific basis that AstraZeneca gave more immunity. Second concern at that time was that if you give 1 vaccine, will it protect? Will it otherwise will it cause infection? Because you are not given the second shot. The first shot is the priming dose. The second shot is the booster dose. So if you don't give the booster dose early, are you exposing for people in that 12 weeks for getting more infection? Here also, what they looked at the data, they found that the protection was of the tune of around 70 to 72% with just one shot. So they then decided that and that this is good enough in a situation like a pandemic, and therefore if they combine the two, then maybe giving the second shot after 12 weeks may be useful. And that was looked at, the data was looked at by the Indian group, the INTAGI, which is a group which looks at vaccines for many years, even before COVID. And then looking at the data, they agreed that maybe we should increase it to 12 to 16 weeks. Some people argue that this may be something that we may consider for all vaccines, because it gives the body's immune system some degree of time to get better priming and may have a better immune response. It was also, I think, to some extent driven by public health, because obviously if you had to delay your second shot, you will have more vaccines available to at least give one shot to people. So that also was something that was done. But there was a paper in Lancet which actually supported this. Regarding the side effects of the vaccine, there are some degree of side effects. A lot of patients have pain at the injection site, fever, body aches, fatigue, which can last for 2 to 3 days. In the older age group, because of what we call immunosense, the older age group immune system is not that robust or not that prime, if I put it. The reaction is not that strong, and it takes time. That's why in the older age group, you don't find that much of a reaction to the vaccine. The younger people's immune system is much more sort of robust, and therefore they have more pain, fatigue, body aches as compared to the older age group. And that is basically because with age, our immune system really comes down a little bit. And that is the reason why there was also a lot of studies that do we need to give a higher dose of vaccine to the older age group as compared to the younger. But the data by all the trials where older people were included showed that even in the older people, the antibody response was good. Coming to the death rate, I think this is something which needs to be counted. And what I personally feel is that there are various ways of doing it. We have a very robust system of reporting deaths. And even if one is concerned that maybe some deaths are not being reported, but are happening, there are deaths which are not being reported as COVID deaths. I personally feel that we have all this data with the Registrar General's Office of all deaths which happen. All deaths in our country are registered, and they are noted because it is important for subsequent things that the family has to do legally and otherwise. If you were to look at all the deaths which are happening, COVID and non-COVID, this year and say last year and year before that, and then see how many of them, how many are extra, you would get an idea of how many extra deaths we had as compared to what we would have every year during this time of the year in terms of average deaths. That will give you an idea how many extra deaths we're having, and that data is there. So this figure that they're quoting is not justified, because that data does not suggest that there is more excessive number of deaths happening as compared to what is already being reported as COVID deaths. But still, I think that data can be looked at, and I'm sure that that is being looked at by the government. Regarding your last question about mixing of vaccines, now that is something which is being tried out, and there are trials which have been done, because there were two things. Is it safe? Does it by chance cause any side effects? And will it be more effective? Now, currently, all the recommendations are that you must take the same vaccine as the prime shot, which is the first shot, and as the booster, which is the second shot. But there are trials which have been done in UK where they have tried the AstraZeneca vaccine and then subsequently given Pfizer vaccine, or they've given AstraZeneca and subsequently given Sputnik. And whatever data that we have of around 600 such subjects suggests, although this is not published as yet, so we need to look at it more critically, that mixing of vaccines may be safe. It did not cause any side effects. And there's some data that it may actually cause better immune response, because now you're looking at two different platforms, and may cause more or a more robust antibody formation in a person. So it's possible that as more data emerges, maybe later in the year, we may have a policy that we could mix vaccines, and that will actually give us more freedom to play around with more of the vaccines that we have in our country. But currently, we need to give the same vaccine as the first and the second shot.
Great. Thank you so much. Now, can I request Shri Suresh Jhunjhunwala to ask his question to Dr. Randeep? You need to unmute yourself.
My compliments, Doctor. You've been very kind to address this and allay a lot of the apprehensions which we had. I have 2-3 questions. One is, you mentioned that this Covaxin was quite effective against the double mutant and the Indian variant also. You didn't mention about Covishield. Is it equally effective as Covaxin against the Indian variant also? That is one. 2, sir, there's an apprehension that suppose a person who has been affected by COVID and he is asymptomatic, so definitely antibodies have developed. Is it safe for him to take a vaccine? He doesn't know. So at what interval or at what level he should take the first dose or between the first and the second dose? Do they have to undergo an RT-PCR test before taking the vaccine, or some rapid antigen test, or check whether they have some kind of a CRP test, whether they have some infection because some people are on a very delicate balance, especially with comorbidities as such. So your guidance on this fact, 2. And third was you said that Oxford, in the UK, they have said that they said that 12 weeks is good enough. But we read in the papers, of course, you would know the facts, that they've again gone back to 4 weeks. So what is the truth in this? We don't know, sir. So your reactions on these 3 things. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so the first question regarding Covishield, whatever data we have, I showed the data from the ICMR, NIV, but there is no data emerging from AstraZeneca itself that Covishield also provides protection against the Indian variant, the B1317, and that it is also effective. Although the vaccine efficacy may come down a little bit, but it is still effective. As compared to asymptomatic individuals, there was been a lot of debate as to should we check everyone with antibodies and then decide or do a rapid antigen test, because we know that almost 30-40% of people may have COVID and be asymptomatic. The data suggests that even in them, if you give the vaccine, there is no harm. And therefore, currently, if you're asymptomatic, one can go ahead and take the vaccine. And that does happen, that someone takes the vaccine and a few days later he gets COVID or his RT-PCR is positive. So current recommendation is that if you're asymptomatic, you have no other symptoms, you should take the vaccine. One accepts the fact that there will be some people who may have COVID while they were taking the vaccine, but there is no data to suggest that that causes more harm, and therefore it can be done. Regarding the change in the guidelines that UK did, UK changed their guidelines for 2 reasons. One is now that they had enough vaccines given to the entire population. And secondly, they found that now they're opening up. They have opened up pubs, they're opening up because their unlocking has started to a large extent. But then they were worried about the variants which are coming in India. And they felt that now maybe it's better for us to vaccinate early rather than late. So they're taking a calculated risk. They don't have data for this. But now they are feeling that we have enough vaccines available, so we can try and vaccinate early. The data that they have still suggests that for COVID, it's usually better to do it at 12 weeks. But again, they have a little bit of a panic because of the fear that if we have a variant which emerges and the vaccine is less effective, it will lead to a huge surge in our country. So just as a panic, or I would say a fear, like they did in December, they are now changing their criteria. But it is not driven by science, but more driven by fear of another surge that may happen. Everyone is concerned about the next wave, if I put it that way.
Can I now request Mr. Vishal?
So one last question, sir. When do you think this is going to taper? The second wave, when do you think we would be more or less, we can be less worried about that? And is there a third wave, what everyone is talking about? And then when is that? And how is the country and the state of it? Yeah.
So these are tough questions. What I would say is that we are seeing a downward trend. Two areas where the trend still has to decline is the southern states, some states in this Tamil Nadu and in Karnataka, and states in the eastern part, especially the northeast. There is still significant number of cases in these areas. But overall, as a country, we are seeing a downward trend, and I am hopeful that by the middle or end of this month, we shall actually see that this peak has come really down significantly, and we are more or less over with the second wave, if I put it that way. But the vaccine, the virus is still going to be there. So we have to learn from remember the mistakes that we did between the first and second wave, because that will really tell us how quickly and how big the third wave is going to be. Virus will come in waves, and it is related to human behavior. If we have a very aggressive behavior and lockdown, the virus tends to come down. As we unlock, it tends to again increase, and we have to be very aggressive in not allowing it to spread. So it is a theory which has been called the hammer and dance theory. As the cases increase, you use the hammer. As the cases decrease, you can then have a little bit of a dance and start unlocking. But that is what we will have to do. So I think we need to really see how we use that, because currently what we need to look at is, if our cases come down, COVID appropriate behavior, making sure crowds don't develop, and having very good surveillance so that we pick up any hotspot early and develop it into a containment zone so that it doesn't spread to other parts of the country, are things which will determine the third wave. But people say that the third wave may come somewhere in October and November.
Thank you. Can I now request Mr. Vishal Jhajaria to ask his question?
Good afternoon, doctors. My question is related to black fungus. So in the first wave, we did not see cases of black fungus. But in the second wave, we are seeing many cases of black fungus. So is it due to some change in the virus itself, or is it for some other reason? And number two is, how do we prevent ourselves from getting the black fungus, especially who are diabetic?
So two questions. One is regarding the black fungus known as mucormycosis. It's not that it was not seen in the first wave. Fungal infections have been linked to COVID, not only now, but even in 2002, 2003 SARS outbreak. But the magnitude of fungal infection that we're seeing now is much more than what we saw in this first wave. We did see a few patients, but not as many. And I think that is related to two or three things. One is, of course, the absolute number of cases. We had less than 1 lakh cases per day. In the first wave, we crossed 4 lakh cases a day in the second wave. So obviously the number was huge. But along with that, as we had said, there was a lot of panic and fear among people. And therefore, there was a lot of misuse of drugs. And that led to three things. One is, of course, like I said, three things drive the fungus. One is COVID itself. Second is poorly controlled sugar. So it's very important that diabetics really control their sugar very aggressively during this time, because both COVID can lead to, diabetes is a comorbidity which can lead to severe COVID infection, and it can also lead to higher chance of fungal infection. So very good control of sugars is important, and many people don't do that. So we've had people who come in and their sugars have been almost to the tune of 400, 500. And there are some who didn't even know that they were diabetics, but their HbA1c, which gives you a 3 months average of the blood sugar, was sometimes 10 or 11, which means that they were having diabetes for many months, but they were not aware of it. So that is one. The second is appropriate use of steroids. Like I've said, in mild cases, there is no need for steroids. But what happens is, some people have mild illness, they have just fever, the saturation is all right, they get a blood test done, their CRP is high. Now, CRP will be high in any febrile illness, but just seeing the CRP being high, they are put on steroids. Now you have a mild illness, and there is data from the recovery trial which showed that steroids were helpful in moderate to severe illness, but they caused more harm in mild illness. They had higher mortality in those who got steroids in mild illness, because it led to what they said super infection. That is, along with COVID, you got a secondary bacterial infection like a pneumonia, which further aggravated your COVID, or you got fungal infection. Therefore, steroids being used early is also a risk factor. Therefore, if we are able to take care of all of this, that is, we monitor our sugars properly, make sure our sugars are under good control, and we have judicious use of steroids, we could prevent the development of mucormycosis.
Great.
Thank you, sir.
Can I now request Dr. Ramesh Chandra Shah to ask his query to Dr. Randeep Guleria?
Hello.
Yes, sir. You're
Good
audible.
afternoon, Dr. Guleria.
Good
I have
afternoon.
been seeing you on many media. Today you have covered everything. I only want to know about the children who does not wear mask. They cannot maintain social distance because they are not aware of anything. So how to prevent them from COVID? And secondly, what is the program for any vaccination? Maybe nasal spray or anything.
Okay, the first important question is, and that is something which has been in everyone's mind, is how do we protect children? And that is why, even if you look at schools and colleges, they still haven't opened. And there is a big debate going on in terms of when we can open schools and colleges, the effect it is happening on children and adolescents in terms of education, in terms of children who are not tech savvy, getting marginalized, and a lot of other issues, including addiction to the smartphone and other social issues that children are facing. So this generation of children and adolescents are going through a lot of changes in their life, which are going to have major effects as far as long-term issues are concerned. And therefore, there is a lot of pressure that one should look at how can we open schools, but do it in a safe manner. And this is something which is not only being looked at here, but across the globe. And you're right, it's very difficult to have children to have to wear masks or to have physical distancing. And that is why people are looking at different strategies. Should we have half the school coming on one day and the other half coming on another day, have different shifts? Can you have people sitting at a distance and making sure that you do some degree of screening at the entrance by either temperature or rapid antigen testing? A lot of things are being looked at. The good thing is that there is enough data now, not only from our own country, but globally, that in children and adolescents, COVID is a mild infection. That is related to multiple factors. The ACE receptors to which the virus attaches are less in children, and therefore they get mild illness. And therefore they are likely not to get severe illness, but they can still be infectious and spread the illness in society, and we need to be careful. Therefore, there are strategies which are being looked at as to how can we protect children, especially as play schools or others open up. Data suggests that even smaller children have even much milder infection than older children. So there are some people who feel that play schools should be the first which should be opened up, and gradually others may be opened up. But there is a lot of discussion going on this. Regarding the vaccine, there are trials which have now been done, and the mRNA vaccine, the Pfizer and Moderna, have been now approved for children, and Bharat Biotech, the Covaxin, has started the trials for vaccinating children between the age of 2 years to 18 years. And by August, September, the trial will be over. So we should have data by September, and possibly we will be able to start vaccinating children by that time. Hopefully other trials from the Covishield vaccine should also come in by them from the international community, and we should be able to then start vaccinating children. So that is hopeful that by the third quarter of this year, children we should be able to start vaccinating them also.
Great. Dr. There are 2 or 3 more questions which have come on the chat box. So would you like me to read it out and then you could answer them?
Okay.
Okay. So the first is from Mr. Ravi Sharma. His question is there a possibility of side effects of the vaccines in future, say after 1 or 2 years, in the form of blood clotting, heart complications, or respiratory problems, as being talked about in some circles? Given the fact that the virus is mysterious and vaccines have been invented somewhat in a haste, is there any possibility that the vaccine may cause side effects which are not known now? And he's written in brackets, I have taken both the shots of Covishield.
Okay, so 2 things. One is long-term side effects of vaccines. Now, one thing I'll say, the vaccines have not been developed in a hurry, because the platforms that were being looked at for these vaccines have been looked at for almost a decade since SARS and MERS outbreak. And even the mRNA vaccine, which was the first to come out, there was a lot of research going on to develop a vaccine for Ebola using the same platform. It's only that when people came to know about the outbreak in January of last year, they were able to convert that same platform for coronavirus. And that really shortened the time of research because they already had a platform available. But I do agree with you that we don't have a long-term follow-up. One would say that for any vaccine, should we have a follow-up of 6 months, 1 year, and then say that it is safe? Most vaccines, if the side effects usually occur within the first 2 to 3 months, and that follow-up was there in most of the vaccine trials in terms of safety. Long-term side effects can rarely occur. They have been reported at times, even with other vaccines, that you may have what we call a post-marketing side effect noted many months later, but these are rare and can happen in certain specific ethnic groups these groups may not have been covered in a large amount in the trials, and when vaccine is rolled out to them, then these side effects may be picked up. So it is possible, but unlikely that you will have any significant side effects in the long run because majority of them would be picked up early. And now that in India we have a large number of people vaccinated, and this is been going on almost for 5-6 months, I think data is robust enough to say that they should be safe. There is a concern of what we call blood clotting, which is it's now called vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia, which has been reported rarely in the Western population, mainly in the Northern European population. This was looked at by looking for side effects in the Indian group, which is vaccinated, and this was found to be very rare. There have been 1 or 2 cases, but in terms of the number reported from the West, it's very, very rare in our country. But these are rare side effects which can occasionally happen.
There is a next question from Shraddha. She's saying, I am a 37-year-old and I have never had COVID, but my D-dimer goes up every month before my periods. We don't know why the D-dimer goes high. CRP, IL-6 and ferritin are all normal. Is it safe for me to take the vaccine? And if yes, which one?
So it's safe for you to take the vaccine, and I'll say whatever vaccine is available, kindly take it. As far as D-dimer is concerned, D-dimer is a non-specific reactor. And therefore, if we find that D-dimer is elevated in any inflammatory syndrome, if you have, let's say, your regular cycles and because of some degree of backache or during that point in time, you may have elevated D-dimer. It can even occur in people who have a cold or a chest infection. Therefore, you have to correlate everything with clinical features because blood reports are sometimes non-specific and don't really point to clotting or anything like that. So I would say don't worry about your D-dimer. Go and take your vaccine, and whatever vaccine is available, Covaxin or Covishield, go ahead and take that.
Okay. I think there are a lot of questions, but I'll just limit to the last two with your permission. The next one is, can people who have undergone kidney transplant and a pregnant lady take this vaccine? And again, which, between Covishield and Covaxin? That's the question from Mayank Agarwal.
So all patients who are immunocompromised post-transplant or on chemotherapy should go and take their vaccine because they come into the high risk group of having severe COVID, and that is why they should take their vaccine. Regarding pregnant women, now the guidelines, the Indian government has approved vaccination for lactating mothers. For pregnant women, it has still not been approved, but there is a lot of data which has emerged, which suggests two things. One is that these vaccines are safe if given in pregnant women. And secondly, pregnancy itself can also be a risk factor leading to more severe COVID and leading to higher chance of fetal either premature deliveries or fetal death. Therefore, a lot of international bodies are now recommending that looking at the risk benefit analysis, we should recommend vaccinating pregnant women also. However, the regulators are still a little reluctant because they want more data. You can't do a large study on pregnant women and then generate that data. This was something which we did for H1N1 swine flu also. So based on whatever data there is, and there is now data which has come from UK in the mRNA vaccine, from US in the mRNA vaccine, where they collected data from women who got the vaccine but were pregnant, didn't know they were pregnant but got the vaccine. They've shown that the vaccines are safe and they actually help as far as pregnant women are concerned. So in my opinion, we should give vaccine to pregnant women, but the guidelines still haven't, the regulatory approval have not come as yet, and the Indian guidelines haven't put that in their manifestation.
So Dr. Saab, the final question which a couple of people have asked is, after how many days a COVID-19 patient can take the vaccine once they are recovered? So, some kind of understanding on that is.
So the current guidelines say that you should take your vaccine 3 months after you've recovered from COVID-19. Previously, we had said 6 weeks, but now looking at the fact that you have good antibodies and these antibodies will give you protection for at least 3 months, even more, it's been recommended that you can take the first shot of your vaccine or your booster dose 3 months after having recovered from COVID-19.
Okay, great. So I think, Dr. we will have a lot more questions, but I want to respect the time that we had requested you for. And with that, I would request Rishabh Kothari, who's our Senior Vice President at the Merchants Chamber of Commerce and Industry, to give a formal vote of thanks for this wonderful session and the time that you've taken out.
Thank you.
Dr. Saab, a very good afternoon and thank you very, very much. I think this was a very, very engaging and informative webinar. Of course, titled Experts Overview on COVID-19, Prevention, Treatment and Post-COVID Effects. But sir, I want to take this opportunity to wholeheartedly thank you for your gracious presence and the insights. I think the presentation you gave, it was one of the most comprehensive. And as Akash had requested you, if we could get a copy, would like to share it with our members. It is a real treat to understand all the nuances of regular COVID challenges and treatment in one presentation itself. So your lucid comments and vast knowledge has really enlightened us today about the current issues. And we are really grateful to you, sir, we know it's a very, very busy time for you. So thank you very much for sharing your valuable thoughts with us. I also take this opportunity to thank our media friends for the continued support and hope that they will suitably cover today's proceedings and more importantly, take the lessons and the guidance that has been provided to a much larger audience. I thank all of you who have joined us here online on this platform, as well as those who are watching us on our various social media platforms. And thank you all for making this session so very worthwhile. I thank you all once again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Saab.
Very much.
Thank you.